Let's take a closer look at three of the John Lennon songs from 1968, one of his singles, Revolution, and then two of the album tracks from the White Album, Happiness is a Warm Gun and Julia. Again, these songs chosen to really help us dig into songs that help support the narrative I'm telling about the development of John Lennon's songwriting. I haven't really had a chance to deal with a couple of my favorite John Lennon songs on Magical Mystery Tour, I Am the Walrus and Glass Onion. So I'm not really picking the songs that are my favorites, but rather the ones I think that advance our story a bit. And I'm trusting that that you will be reading along in the recommended textbook and listening and sort of taking some of what I'm saying about these things and applying it to these other songs that may be favorites of yours. So you've got an opportunity to maybe use some of my interpretation to see whether that enriches songs that you know that I'm not having a chance to directly talk about in detail. So let's hit on Revolution now and see what we can make of this. Of course, there are two versions, well, not counting Revolution number 9. There are two versions of Revolution. The slow one, which appears on the White Album, which is the first one to be recorded. That's the one that John wanted to be a single at the same time as Hey Jude was released as a single. And the rest of the guys in the band thought that the song was too slow. And they also thought, you know, John, I don't think it's such a good idea for us to be making such a obvious statement about politics. I mean, no matter how firmly you believe something, people in the entertainment business are often of the opinion, especially back in the 60s, that, you know, you don't want to alienate people. As much as you may get the accolades from one side of the aisle, you may end up alienating the other side. And so better just to kind of stay neutral. Be Switzerland, you know, just stay neutral in all of this. Anyway, he really wanted this song to be the A side of the single, so he had them keep working on it until they got a faster and more aggressive version. And he did get it released on the single as the B side to Hey Jude, and as we said before, he did have a pretty good hit with it in this country. It's a contrasting verse-chorus form, starts with an intro, and then you get a verse-chorus pair, another verse-chorus pair. In the faster version, then you get an instrumental verse, but in the slower version, that's not there. It just goes on to another verse-chorus pair. So the lyrics, as I said before, offer a political statement, and it's the first real overt political statement since Taxman. Now, remember, we wanted to connect this song up, I've said a couple of times, connecting it up with Paul's song Blackbird, but Blackbird was never considered really as a single. It was considered an album cut. But remember, the whole business about being political had to do with the discussion of whether or not they should lead with it as a single or not whether or not it should be on a Beatles record. No, that was the issue with Revolution number 9, whether it should even be on the album. No, they always wanted this one on the album. They just weren't sure that was the right for a single. So anyway, the tune, as we said before, a contrasting verse-chorus form. It's noteworthy that it's combo instrumentation. So we got no big studio effects going on here or anything. I mean, the ways in which they created the distortion on the guitars is a kind of a studio effect by running it directly into the board and through a couple of compressors and having them right on the edge of sort of, you know, blowing a fuse or blowing up or overheating the old analog tube mixing boards that they were using. But it doesn't sound like it's studio trickery creating like we get in some of the other music that uses studio effects. It sounds very much like the Beatles just jamming out in a room singing this song, and it's got a kind of a loose kind of feel to it. And why do I point to that? Because it's not psychedelic. There are other John songs, Revolution number 9 being a very good example, other John songs that are experimental. Glass Onion's got some great sort of experimental things sort of going on in effects, but this is not it. This is, you know, sort of straight ahead rock and roll. Hey Jude, remember the A side, and AABA with partial reprise. Again, going right for what you think people want to hear, trying to put it right down the middle of the plate. So with these singles, you're going to have success. Save the more experimental stuff for the album cuts. Well, speaking of experimental stuff, Happiness is a Warm Gun is a very interesting development of John Lennon as the kind of progressive songwriter sort of trying to do various kinds of avant-garde kind of things. The best thing I can tell you about the form of this song is that it's episodic. And by episodic, we said a bit about that with regard to Paul and Martha, My Dear, and maybe that being episodic in the sense that maybe the ending to lovely Rita episodic. You might even think there's something episodic about Hey Jude having this big long song and then like a whole big coda that's almost half the song in and of itself. But in this case, we get an A section, a B section, a C section, and a D section. There's really no sense in which things, come back or round off or anything like that. It's things that are placed next to each other, almost the way a medley of tunes would be in a medley of, music theater tunes or something that you might hear in or pops tunes or something you might hear an orchestra do. Well, of course, this idea of episodic with these various fragments that are placed next to each other to create things that don't necessarily repeat becomes very important with the second half of Abbey Road. The second side of Abbey Road is exactly that. On that piece, that second side, there are things that come back in interesting and important kinds of ways, but there's a lot of episodic composition going on, something that Paul McCartney really started to take an interest in. In many ways, it's anticipated by the putting together the John song and the Paul song in A Day of the Life, except in there's a rounding off by bringing the first thing back again. Here, with Happiness is a Warm Gun, it just sort of progresses section to section. And the way the sections go seem to have to do with various interpretations of the word gun. Now, we talked before about the lyrics being inspired by either a gun ad or a gun magazine. I've seen this in various sources as being an NRA ad, a gun magazine that George Martin showed John Lennon, whatever it was. He got this idea, he saw a gun, and he decided Happiness is a Warm Gun was kind of a very provocative kind of phrase that he thought he could do something with. People who followed the old Peanuts comic strip in the 1960s, the Charles Schulz Peanuts strip, may remember that one of the things that one of the mottos of Charlie Brown was happiness is a warm puppy, and of course that puppy was Snoopy. So this whole happiness is a warm gun kind of thing sort of in the culture, sort of floating around and sort of showing up in different kinds of ways. The word play here has to do with the word gun and the word shoot. And when you think about gun, you can think about a gun maybe being a needle. You shoot with a needle in terms of drug. You need a fix or something like that. You can jump the gun. In other words, move too quickly. A gun can be a metaphor for sexual, for the male sexual anatomy. You know what I'm trying to say here. I don't want to get in trouble in case there are kids watching here, but you know what I mean. So actually, jump the gun could actually be seen as a kind of a double entendre. And then shoot can have to do with the shooting of drugs, the shooting of a gun, the shooting of sex. After all, if that gun is a metaphor for the male appendage, shoot. So as the song goes through, he continues to kind of play with that, and you know that he's sort of having this fun with the wordplay when he gets at the very end. And he does this kind of stylistic irony. And this is interesting. The Beatles playing with previous styles, but not in a kind of earnest, just kind of fun way, like it's fun to play music in an old style, but using it in a way that's ironic, distanced in a certain kind of way. I'm doing 50s music, but I want you to know I'm doing 50s music because it's kind of funny that I'm saying this and doing it in a 50s style. That's very different than just doing a 50s style because you think it sounds hip and it's fun and it's inspiring and that kind of thing. So this ironic use of style, we'll talk about this when we talk about George Harrison as well. You can see that in this at the end, especially the 50s style, where John even goes into like a voiceover, like an old Elvis record or something, where he sort of recite the lyrics in a kind of overdrawn, exaggerated kind of way, and then the kind of high falsetto sort of R&B singer thing that he does. All of that sort of coming together around this experiment, around a little phrase. Happiness is a warm gun. So it's really, in many ways, a kind of a sleeper song on the album because it predicts so much of what's coming on Abbey Road and then in the solo careers of both John and Paul in terms of this episodic design. Of course, the wordplay, always a part of what's going on with John Lennon's songs. We turn now to the song Julia. I choose to talk about this song, again, maybe not the most obvious one to pull off the White Album in terms of songs that people talk about with regard to John Lennon all the time. But the thing that's most interesting to me about Julia is that it's one of the few songs we can find from John during this period that really are confessional again. I mean, a song that isn't derived from, some kind of a found source or other kind of thing. Here's a case where he's being absolutely confessional and serious and really sort of exposing his emotional self to the listener. Of course, all of this is very singer-songwriter, and the idea that he's doing it with a guitar, very earnest and confessional in all the ways that singer-songwriter will continue to be into the 1970s. I say the lyrics are very personal. He's read a poem by Khalil Gibran, and there was a line in it that really caught his attention. The song can maybe be seen as a sort of a song to his mother, who, if you know the John Lennon story, died when John was still a teenager. Devastating blow to him, but also to Yoko, the woman, the sort of the new woman in his life, who was sort of taking that role as the woman that was close to him. I mean, hearing this song as a guy singing a song to his mother who's dead is enormously moving, and it's leaves him enormously vulnerable. There's none of that smart alecky John Lennon here. It's just him opening his heart. And it's one of the, I pointed out because it's one of the very few ones we see like that during this period. It takes us back to Help. Remember talking about I'm not, measuring up to people's expectations of me. In My Life, where he talks about, thinking about his past and that kind of thing. And also reminds me an awful lot about the song Across the Universe. You say, well, that's coming on a future album. Actually, Across the Universe was written before Julia. So in many ways, Across the Universe and Julia are almost kind of paired as songs that sort of are John sort of being the vulnerable poet with none of the anger, none of the attitude, none of the smart alecky kind of thing that he does so well. But it's not that. It's just him opening up to maybe who he is, or that part of who he is. The song itself, a slightly modified ABA form. It's mostly an ABA form, except there's an alternate verse that's inserted a couple of times, as you see on the form diagram here. So from that point of view, not particularly ambitious from a form point of view. In terms of the instrumentation, very simple. Again, very singer-songwriterly, and with a real attention to the craft of each individual word. Everything that will become part of the singer-songwriter movement into the 1970s. Well, having looked now at those three John Lennon songs together, let's see what's happening with George and Ringo on the White Album.